May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord. It all seemed to end on Friday. It started off great. The disciples and Jesus got together on Thursday for the eating of the Passover meal, the time when they remembered that God had delivered the Israelites from the land of Egypt and brought them out of slavery. But then quickly things went south. After the dinner, he was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was tortured. He was beaten. The next day, he was crucified on a cross. He died, placed in a tomb. Is this the end, or is this the beginning? Other Gospels tell us that there was no time left on Friday to prepare Jesus' body properly. When someone died in those times, they would place the body in a tomb and they would put spices all around to kill the odor of the decaying flesh. And when, after many months, there was only bones left, they would take these bones and put them in a smaller box called an ossuary. And that could be placed somewhere. It wasn't a very large box. And so one of the other Gospels tells us that the women were going to the tomb early on Sunday in order to put spices around the body so that it would be properly prepared. It was a normal kind of thing to do. They expected to get there and do their job. So the women go to the tomb, just as we go to the cemetery. I remember as a boy, 2-3 times a year, my mother would say to my father, let's go up to the cemetery. So my brother and I and my parents would pile into the car and we'd go 50, 60 minutes north to Kensico Cemetery to visit the grave of my grandfather. And after my mother would tidy up a bit, then she said, all right, I'm going to go visit some of the other graves. She knew a number of people who had been buried there. And she'd wander from grave to grave to grave until she was satisfied and we could return home. And so the women are also now going to the tomb. They go early. And then as they get there, the unthinkable happens. They could not imagine. There was an angel there who said, he is not here. He is risen. How can that be? It's impossible. And yet that is the word that was proclaimed to them, and that is the word that is proclaimed to us. Jesus is raised. He is not here. Do they trust that word? Do they believe it? Or do they not? And that's the question that was raised not just to them, but to you and me. Do we believe that word? Or do we not? Is it an end, or is it a beginning? Trevor Miller talks about hiking through the Cascade Mountains in Oregon. He says the group traveled through the higher elevation through snow, and then they went down into the valleys where it was lush and green. And then they came to a place which was black, charred. And the guide turned to them and he said, 2,000 acres had burned down. And this is what's left. Nothing. But as they walked through this charred mess, he could see little green shoots coming up through what seemed to be deadness. And he realized that life was beginning again. See, is it the end, or is it the beginning? Is the death of Jesus the end? No one was actually present at the time Jesus rose from the dead. No one saw that. We only see the results. An angel saying, "He is not here. He is risen." It's a beginning. He appears to the women. He appears to the disciples. He appears to Paul. And they are all convinced that he's resurrected. He appears to them many times. They eat together, they talk together. There was no doubt in their minds that he was raised. And Paul is so convinced, he says, "I have to go into Asia Minor to tell this news to the Gentiles, the non-Jews. And to the disciples he says, you guys stay here in Judea and tell the Jews this." And so he goes up to what's now Turkey and then over to Greece, telling them about the resurrection. And little congregations begin to form. And then eventually a church forms with its headquarters in Rome. It grows. It grows. And today we are here because Christ lives. We are here because he has called you and has called me to be here today. How he does that, I don't know. But one way or another, we have found our way here to hear this same news. How often during the week I will say to someone, "Look how the Lord has worked this week. I could not have put this together, but it happened. Out of death comes life." It's amazing. Often I'll say to someone who is floundering, they don't know which way to go, I'll say, "The Lord will lead you. Be open. Look for it. It's not your decision alone." You see, Jesus did not simply rise from the tomb to be alive again. He rose for Mary, for the disciples. He rose for you, and he rose for me. We need to open our eyes and see him around us. It's not just luck that sometimes visits upon us. It's the power of God to bring life out of death as he chooses. Will Willimon, a Methodist pastor, bishop, often writes about his experience with the resurrected Christ. And he tells of the time when he was teaching a course at a church-related college. He had in mind to teach a course which he was going to call "Jesus, the Most Interesting Person in the World." But when he brought it to the curriculum committee, they didn't like it. They said, "We feel that you're proselytizing, that you're trying to get these students to become members of your church." And he says, "Me? I'm a Protestant. He says, I don't know how to proselytize. I'm glad we get a few people in church. Well, anyway, he went back and he thought about it, and he changed the name of the course to Jesus Throughout the Centuries. The committee liked that. It was going to be a history course. And colleges are into history, you see. The Department of Religion is no longer a Department of Theology. It's really a department of the history of religion. It's how people have responded, how they act, how they worship. God is left out of that picture. But at his first class with the students, he says, I want to be honest with you. He says, if you want to study history, go and take a course on George Washington. You'll learn all about history. But this is going to be more than history. Yes, Jesus was a person whom we can study historically. But more than that, he has come to people, and they have experienced his presence in their lives. They have experienced him as a living presence, and it's changed them. It's changed our world. Christ is risen. Christ is present for you. And he comes to make a difference in your life. He comes to change your life. If he is risen for you, then that is what's most important. You see, if Christ is not risen, nothing really matters. Everything ends up in dust. But if Christ is risen, that's the most important thing in the world. There's nothing more important for you and for me. The God of the Bible is a God of life and resurrection. He brought the children of Israel out of Egypt, out of an existence of death. And he brings us out of death into life and resurrection. You see, if he is not a God of life, then why should we even worship him? It doesn't matter. We all end up, as I said before, in dust. But if he is the one who brings us life, then he is the most important presence in our lives. Is it the end or beginning? We proclaim today that it is a beginning. And with the whole church, we say, Christ is risen. Hallelujah. Let's continue by singing our next hymn, hymn number 90.